A man smiled at a funeral, but it wasn't his to smile at. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your comments mean the world to me. I always love reading them. Let's begin. Chief Inspector Maigret was standing by the window of his office, though the office seemed more a waiting room that morning than a place for work. He had arrived earlier than usual, when the fog still clung to the pavements along Boulevard Richard Lenoir, and he had not yet removed his heavy overcoat. His pipe, lit twice already, had gone out again in his hand. The radiator hissed quietly, filling the silence with a soft, insistent reminder of the cold outside. He wasn't expecting a case. He rarely expected anything anymore. Things simply arrived, like the damp air that seeped under the doorways of Paris. Still he lingered there, watching the slow drift of people beginning their day. Men in dark coats, women with scarves tied tight, clerks moving with purpose, and always the errand boys, their caps pulled low. He felt the city's pulse, faint yet insistent, and sometimes that pulse told him something was amiss before the words reached his ears. The telephone on his desk remained stubbornly silent. Janvier was somewhere in the building, and Lucas had promised to bring a report about a petty theft that had gone sour in Montparnasse. Routine things, without drama. Even Inspector Lognon had no misfortune to report, which was in itself unusual. Yet beneath the quiet, Maigret sensed a restlessness, like a cough smothered in the next room. When the door opened, it wasn't Lucas or Janvier, but a clerk from downstairs carrying a small envelope. The handwriting on the front was neat, deliberate, but oddly old-fashioned. Maigret didn't open it at once. He sat at his desk, relit his pipe, and studied the envelope the way he studied people. With patience, waiting for it to reveal itself. Inside was only a few lines. Unsigned. You will not know me, Monsieur le Commissaire, but if you were to pass the churchyard of Saint-Denis this afternoon, you might notice something that others have ignored. A man who smiles when no one else does. There was nothing else. No date, no explanation, not even a name. Maigret read it twice, then placed it on the desk blotter, his thick fingers pressing the paper flat. He leaned back, pipe smoke curling slowly above his head. A prank, perhaps. Yet the words had a peculiar weight, a restraint that was not common in pranksters. He thought of funerals. How often he had stood at the back of small chapels, watching the living trying to measure grief against routine. Smiles were rare there, and when they appeared, they had their own story to tell. In the afternoon, after a modest lunch with Madame Maigret, stew, potatoes, a glass of red wine, he decided not to return directly to headquarters. Instead, he allowed himself to wander north, following streets that grew narrower, more anonymous, until he reached Saint-Denis. The church stood grey and massive, its stone darkened by rain. It was by chance, or so it seemed, that a funeral procession was gathering. A modest one. A few carriages, some black umbrellas, the subdued murmur of relatives huddling close. The air smelled of damp earth and candle wax. Maigret blended in at the edge, his hat low, his overcoat buttoned. The coffin was borne past him, the pallbearers awkward in their heavy steps. He glanced at the mourners one by one, not searching but absorbing. Women with reddened eyes, men with solemn mouths, a child clutching a handkerchief much too large. Then near the back a man stood slightly apart. He was not young, but not yet old, dressed plainly, though with more care than most. His hands were folded before him, his shoulders stooped, and on his face, faint but unmistakable, lingered a smile. Not broad, not mocking. A smile as if he were remembering something agreeable, while all others were lost in grief. Maigret did not move. He merely watched, as if watching a man on a quiet street corner. The procession moved on. The smile did not fade, and Maigret felt that subtle weight again, the one that had pressed against him all morning. It was nothing, yet it was everything. Later, as he walked back through the rain-washed streets, his pipe unlit in his pocket, Maigret wondered not about the dead, but about the living man who had smiled at the wrong funeral. Maigret had learned long ago not to hurry such matters. A smile at a funeral was not a crime, nor even a scandal, but it clung to him in a way that idle curiosities never did. He had seen enough of life to know that people betrayed themselves not in grand gestures, but in small misplaced ones. And so rather than ask questions on the spot, he had followed the procession with a heavy patience, keeping himself apart. The mourners wound their way through the narrow paths of the cemetery, shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth where rain had lingered. The coffin was lowered. The priest murmured his phrases in a voice dulled by routine, and the family stood huddled under umbrellas. Maigret watched, but not them. He watched the man who stood several paces behind the others, as though he belonged but not entirely. The smile had faded, yet the trace of it remained around his eyes, a certain looseness, like someone too comfortable in a room where others shifted uneasily. The inspector did not approach. He never liked to break such silences, for people revealed more when left alone than when confronted. Instead, he let the moment dissolve, waited until the mourners began to drift away, and then turned back toward the street. He took note of one detail. The man had left alone without speaking to anyone, without even a polite handshake or a nod of condolence. He simply adjusted his hat, straightened his collar, and walked off briskly toward the tram stop. That evening, in the quiet of his flat on Boulevard Richard Lenoir, Madame Maigret poured him a second glass of wine and asked, with her usual discreet curiosity, what had occupied him all afternoon. He answered vaguely, as he often did, not out of secrecy but out of habit. He told her there had been a funeral, nothing official, and that he had noticed someone peculiar there. She smiled in that tolerant way of hers, the way a woman smiles at a husband who collects odd pebbles from the street and pockets them. It must mean something. If it held you all this time, she said, setting down the dish she had cleared. It may mean nothing, Maigret muttered, his pipe smoke curling above him, but I can't quite put it down. The next morning, he arrived at the office later than usual, his coat still smelling faintly of the rain from his walk. Janvier was at his desk scribbling notes, and Lucas came in with a file under his arm. Both men paused when they saw the chief inspector settling heavily into his chair, with that look of distant rumination. "There's nothing pressing, Chief," Lucas offered. "A burglary in Belleville, but the local station has it well in hand." Maigret grunted, more to himself than in response. He picked up the envelope that still lay on his blotter, the anonymous letter that had brought him to Saint-Denis in the first place. He turned it over, examining the paper as though for the first time, noting the faint creases, the steady hand that had written those words. It was no scribble. Whoever had sent it wanted him to take it seriously. "Janvier," he said at last, "do you know if there was a burial yesterday at Saint-Denis? A man of about 60, perhaps." Janvier, quick and efficient, fetched the register after some telephone calls. The deceased was named Auguste Fumel, a retired accountant, widower with 2 daughters. He had lived modestly in a small apartment not far from the church. His death was recorded as natural. A heart seizure during the night. A quiet life, it seems, Janvier concluded, sliding the notes across the desk. Maigret listened, his thick fingers drumming the armrest of his chair. He asked one more question almost idly. "Were there many at the funeral?" "Not many. Family, a few neighbors. Nothing out of the ordinary. Except for the man who smiled." He sent Janvier to make discreet inquiries with the daughters, not as police business, but as one of those casual verifications that raised no suspicion. Meanwhile, Maigret himself decided to walk once more through the streets near the church. He had always believed that places remembered things, if one knew how to listen. The quarter was unremarkable, grey tenements pressed against one another, a bakery with its shutters half open, a small cafe with fogged windows. Life moved at its usual pace, indifferent to yesterday's funeral. Yet as he sat with his beer at a corner table, Maigret noticed the cafe owner greet a man who entered, the very man he had seen smiling. The fellow ordered a coffee, exchanged a few words with the proprietor, and took a seat by the window. His manner was calm, almost too calm, like someone used to blending in. His eyes scanned the street but avoided faces. Maigret watched him in silence, neither hiding nor revealing his attention, simply existing in the same space until it became impossible for the other man not to notice. When their eyes did meet, it was brief, a flicker, but something passed there, recognition or perhaps unease. The man finished his coffee quickly, left a coin on the table and stepped outside. Maigret did not follow immediately. He let him go, waited until the street had swallowed him, then rose, paid for his beer, and asked the proprietor casually, "Who was that?" "Oh, him? Name's Charles d'Archambault. He rents a room above the shoemaker's on Rue des Ursulines. Been here a few months. Quiet type, keeps to himself. Does he work nearby? Clerk of some sort, I think. Comes in often enough. Nothing remarkable. Nothing remarkable, except a smile at a funeral and a letter that had led Maigret there. By late afternoon, Janvier returned with more detail about Auguste Fumel's household. The daughters had spoken freely. Their father had lived without extravagance, without enemies. They were bewildered by the inquiry, touched even that the police would take notice. They remembered only vaguely the people at the funeral. Mostly family friends, no mention of a d'Archambault, Janvier reported. That night, as the inspector walked home under a drizzle that softened the glow of the street lamps, he felt the case settling over him like a coat he had not chosen, but could not take off. No crime had been committed, perhaps none would be. Yet something drew him on, as though the city itself had nudged him toward this man with the wrong expression at the wrong time. Back in his apartment, Madame Maigret had set aside his slippers by the stove, and as he lowered himself into the chair with a sigh, she asked again gently, "Will you tell me what you are following?" He shook his head, not out of secrecy, but because it was still only a shadow. "A man," he said simply. "A man who doesn't quite fit where he ought to." She nodded, untroubled, and poured him his evening beer. And Maigret, with the smoke of his pipe curling slowly upward, thought again of Charles d'Archambault and of what a smile might conceal. The next morning was heavy with fog, the kind that muffled the usual clatter of carts and tram bells, so that Paris seemed to breathe more slowly. Maigret left his flat later than usual, his hat pulled low, the collar of his coat turned up against the damp. He had slept poorly, his mind circling around the quiet figure of Charles d'Archambault, a man who seemed to fit nowhere, and whose smile at a funeral had etched itself into Maigret's thoughts as if it were an unanswered riddle. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the routine business of the day pressed on. Janvier was already at his desk, while Lucas came in with a report on a brawl that had ended in broken noses and little else. Maigret listened with one ear, nodding gravely though his attention was elsewhere. He pulled the anonymous letter toward him once more, the faint smell of the ink still lingering, and studied the words as though repetition might yield something new. Someone had wanted him there. Someone had known in advance that the smile would be worth noticing. He sent Lucas to check on Charles d'Archambault's background. No urgency, he told him. Just a matter of curiosity. Lucas raised an eyebrow. He knew his chief well enough to recognize the tone that meant something more than idle curiosity, but he asked no questions. By midday, Maigret himself took a walk through the Rue des Ursulines, where the shoemaker's sign creaked faintly in the damp air. The lodgings above were typical of the quarter. Narrow stairs, thin walls, the faint smell of cabbage and damp plaster. The concierge, a sharp-eyed woman with a scarf tied tightly over her hair, looked him up and down before deciding to speak. "Monsieur d'Archambault." "Yes, he has a room here. Pays on time, never trouble. Out early, back late. A quiet man." She narrowed her eyes, trying to read Maigret's interest. "Is it police business?" Maigret only smiled faintly, his large frame filling the dim corridor. "Just routine." He climbed the worn stairs slowly, pausing on the landing to listen. The doors were closed, but one could hear the muffled chatter of a radio, the sound of someone chopping vegetables, the ordinary rhythm of lives pressing together in too small a space. d'Archambault's door was unremarkable, its paint chipped. Maigret noted that the lock was new, too new for the doorframe around it. He did not knock. He simply stood for a long moment, filling his pipe as though listening to the silence of a room could tell him its secrets. Back at headquarters, Lucas returned with a thin file. d'Archambault Charles, age 49. Born in Tours, no criminal record, worked as a clerk for a small import business in Paris. No wife, no children, no military distinctions. A man whose life was a list of unremarkable entries. Almost too clean, Lucas muttered. Or too ordinary, Maigret replied, tamping down the tobacco in his pipe. He let the silence draw out until Lucas shifted uneasily and left the room. Only then did Maigret allow his thoughts to surface. He had encountered such men before, figures who moved like shadows at the edges of other people's lives, leaving little behind. Some were harmless, some were not. The trouble was in knowing which. That evening, after supper, Madame Maigret remarked as she folded away the tablecloth that he seemed preoccupied. He admitted as much, though in his vague way. He spoke of the smile of the anonymous letter, of the sense that someone had wanted his attention fixed on d'Archambault. She listened quietly, her hands still, and then said almost idly, "It's strange, isn't it? Most people prefer not to be noticed. But this man, whoever wrote you that letter, wanted you to look. Why?" It was exactly the question he had been circling without words. He kissed her cheek before setting out again into the fog. He found himself drawn back to the café where he had first seen d'Archambault. The place was warm with steam and tobacco, crowded with clerks and apprentices. He ordered a beer, sat heavily, and let the chatter wash over him. When d'Archambault entered at last, it was without fanfare. Yet Maigret noticed immediately the subtle shift among the regulars. A nod here, a glance there, but no real connection. He was known, but not known well. D'Archambault sat, ordered his usual, and pulled a newspaper from his coat pocket. His eyes skimmed the print, though Maigret thought he read little. From time to time he looked up as though expecting something. It was then that Maigret decided to move. Slowly, deliberately, he rose, crossed the smoky room, and seated himself at the table opposite. "You don't mind?" he asked in his deep, even voice. The other man blinked, startled but too polite to refuse. "No, not at all." His smile flickered again, that same faintly misplaced expression. They sat in silence a moment before Maigret said, "I believe we were both at the funeral yesterday." d'Archambault's hand paused on the newspaper, his eyes flicking upward. "Yes, I was there. Friend of the deceased?" "Not exactly. An acquaintance, you could say. We lived in the same quarter. I thought it proper to attend." Maigret nodded, puffed his pipe, let the silence grow. The man shifted slightly in his seat, adjusted his collar, then added, "A sad business. Poor man, died suddenly, I hear." "Heart," Maigret said simply. "Yes, yes, heart." The words were correct, but the rhythm was wrong, and Maigret felt the unease deepen. He asked nothing more, only sipped his beer and regarded the man with that steady, unreadable gaze. At length d'Archambault finished his coffee, folded the newspaper, and excused himself with a polite bow. When he had gone, the proprietor leaned over, polishing a glass. "A strange one, that. Always alone. Sometimes talks too much, sometimes not at all. You never quite know where you stand with him." Maigret grunted, his eyes following the empty doorway. That night, back in his flat, he sat long after Madame Maigret had gone to bed, the pipe smoke curling in the dim light. Someone had written to him about the man who smiled at the wrong funeral. Someone wanted him to see, but why? What did the smile conceal, and why did it matter? The fog outside thickened, pressing against the glass. Maigret sat heavy in his chair, waiting, as he always did, for the city to yield its secret. The following morning, the fog had lifted, but the sky remained heavy, the kind that promised more rain before the day was done. Maigret rose later than usual, his body carrying the weight of a night spent half awake, replaying in silence the small gestures and clipped words of Charles d'Archambault. He had not spoken much, but silence often revealed more than speech. There had been the pause before the word heart, the faint strain in his voice when pressed about his connection to the deceased. Such details were never evidence, yet Maigret had learned they formed the true map of a man's soul. At the Quai des Orfèvres, he found Lucas waiting, a folder in his hand and a curious expression on his face. "I asked around about d'Archambault," he said as soon as the inspector removed his coat. "There's not much. He's employed at Brossard and Phil's, a small import firm near Les Halles. Keeps to his accounts, punctual, polite. Nothing irregular." Maigret sat down heavily, filled his pipe, and let the smoke drift before replying. "Nothing irregular, except he's drawn to funerals of men he barely knew." Lucas shrugged, uneasy. "Perhaps he has an interest in death." "Some people do," Maigret didn't answer. He reached for the anonymous letter again, smoothing it with his large hand. It remained the pivot of the whole affair. Someone had known enough to predict his presence at the funeral, to draw his attention to the man who smiled. Whoever it was, they were watching from a distance. By mid-morning, Maigret sent Janvier to speak again with the daughters of Auguste Fumel. It was not suspicion of the dead man that interested him, but the constellation of people around the death. Fumel had lived quietly, they had said, but even quiet lives leave trails of connection. Neighbors, tradesmen, casual acquaintances. Sometimes those trails brushed against strangers in ways that seemed trivial, until one looked closer. In the meantime, Maigret decided to pay a visit to Brossard and Phil's. The firm was housed in a narrow building, with peeling paint, tucked between a warehouse and a grocer's stall. Inside, the air smelled faintly of spices and damp paper. Clerks hunched over ledgers at long tables, their pens scratching like restless insects. At the back office, a man with a thin mustache and harried eyes introduced himself as Brossard. "Yes, Darchambault works here," he said with a trace of impatience. "Reliable fellow, quiet. We're lucky to have him. He doesn't complain, doesn't cause trouble. Lives alone, I believe." "Why the interest?" "Routine," Maigret replied in his even voice. He lingered, asking nothing more, but listening carefully as Brossard filled the silence with small details. How Darchambault arrived earlier than most, how he never lingered at lunch, how he seemed to take no pleasure in the camaraderie of his colleagues. Always alone, yet never impolite. A man who slid through life without leaving marks. As he walked back along the wet pavements, Maigret found himself brooding over a different question. Was Darchambault the one under scrutiny, or merely the bait in someone else's game? The letter remained unexplained. It was not Darchambault who had written it. That much was clear. Someone else had decided the smile mattered, someone who wished Maigret to notice. That evening, Janvier returned with his report. The daughters had spoken more openly this time, though still with confusion. Their father had been a man of routine, precise to the point of obsession. He had kept meticulous accounts of his modest pension, spent evenings reading the newspaper, rarely ventured far. They knew of no disputes, no debts, no quarrels with neighbors. Only one detail caught Maigret's attention. In the weeks before his death, Fumel had mentioned almost in passing that a stranger had spoken to him outside the church after Mass. A man he could not quite place, who had asked oddly polite questions about his health and his past work. Did they describe him? Maigret asked. Not clearly. Only that he was middle-aged, soft-spoken, with a smile that seemed peculiar. Maigret tapped the stem of his pipe against his palm, the weight of the thought settling deeper. He asked Janvier to check discreetly with the parish priest. Perhaps he had noticed this stranger. Janvier nodded and left at once. That night at home, Madame Maigret served him a dish of boiled beef with carrots. She listened as she always did, her hands folded after clearing the plates. He spoke sparingly, yet she understood the shape of his thoughts. "It troubles you," she said softly, "because it isn't yet a crime, only a shadow, and you wait to see if the shadow will move." He looked at her with the faintest smile. She always found the words he himself did not. Yes, exactly. The following day brought rain again, steady and persistent. Janvier returned with news. The priest recalled a man who had loitered near the entrance of the church, not every Sunday, but often enough to be noticed. He had not belonged to the parish. He had spoken to Fumel once or twice, but never joined the congregation. Did he give a name? No, chief, but the description, it could match Darchambault. The circle was tightening, though Maigret felt less satisfaction than weariness. The man had hovered around Fumel in life, appeared again at his burial, and carried on with a smile where others bent under grief. The pattern was there, yet the motive lay hidden like a stone under water. He decided, as he often did, to wait. He returned to the café that evening, ordered a beer and settled heavily into his corner. Hours passed, smoke thickened, voices rose and fell. At last Darchambault appeared, his hat dripping with rain, his manner calm. He ordered his usual, unfolded a newspaper, and for a long while ignored the inspector's presence. Maigret watched without speaking. It was not an interrogation, not yet. It was the slow pressing of silence, the kind that made men uncomfortable in their own skin. Darchambault drank, folded his paper, and at last, perhaps compelled by the weight of that steady gaze, he looked across the room. Their eyes met. For the briefest second the smile returned, faint, inscrutable, and then, without a word, Darchambault left. Maigret did not follow. He sat with his beer, the rain drumming against the windows, and felt again the invisible hand of the letter-writer guiding him. He was no longer watching a man in isolation. He was caught in the slow unfolding of someone else's design. The smile was a clue, yes, but it was also an invitation. He tamped his pipe, filled it carefully, and let the smoke rise as he considered the simplest, most troubling question: who had wanted him there? And what truth was waiting behind this strange, misplaced smile? The day after, Paris wore the same damp coat of drizzle, the pavements gleaming darkly beneath the lamps even at midday. Maigret moved more slowly than usual, his heavy frame burdened not by fatigue alone, but by the peculiar weight of an investigation that was not yet an investigation at all. Nothing official tied him to Charles d'Archambault. There was no crime, no complaint, only a letter without a signature and a smile at the wrong time. Yet his instincts told him that something lived in the shadow of these details, something that would not let go until it was brought into the open. At his office, the atmosphere was subdued. Lucas and Janvier busied themselves with the ordinary grind of cases, stolen purses, a fight at a dance hall, the petty cruelties of city life, but their eyes flicked toward Maigret from time to time, measuring his silence. He said little, but the pipe smoke rising steadily from his corner told them his mind was elsewhere. His mind was elsewhere. Toward the end of the morning, a note arrived from the concierge of the Rue des Ursulines, delivered through the central desk. It was brief, written in a rushed hand. Monsieur d'Archambault has had a visitor these past 2 nights. A woman. She leaves before dawn. Thought it might be of interest. The message was unsigned, but Maigret guessed it came from the same sharp-eyed woman who had spoken to him on the stair. He folded the note carefully, slipped it into his pocket, and sat for a long moment staring at the rain streaking the window. A woman. Until now, d'Archambault had seemed a man without ties. In the late afternoon, he walked again through the quarter. The streets smelled of wet wool and roasting chestnuts, the vendors hunched under their awnings. He paused near the shoemaker's shop, watching the stairwell where tenants came and went. There was no sign of d'Archambault, no sign of the woman. Yet patience was his habit, and so he settled into the café across the street, ordered his beer and waited. It was nearly dusk when the woman appeared. She descended quickly, her coat pulled tight, her face partly hidden by a scarf. She was not young, perhaps in her 40s, with a certain worn elegance that suggested better days behind her. She walked briskly, not looking back, and turned toward the tram. Maigret let her go. He would not chase her through the wet streets like a common gendarme. He merely noted her bearing, the faint tremor in her haste, the fact that she had come and gone without greeting the neighbors. That night, back at Boulevard Richard-Lenoir, he told Madame Maigret only that the man was not as solitary as he had seemed. She raised her eyebrows slightly, amused, but asked no further questions. They ate in companionable quiet, the inspector brooding over the woman's appearance, while the smell of boiled potatoes and leeks filled the room. The following morning, he sent Janvier to the civil registry. By noon, Janvier returned with a discovery. d'Archambault had once been married more than 20 years ago in Tours. The marriage had ended quickly, annulled after 2 years. Since then, no record of another union. No mention of children. The name of the former wife was entered in the record, Claire Vionnet. Maigret repeated the name softly, as if testing it on his tongue. It rang faintly of something he could not yet place. He asked Janvier to check further, discreetly, through electoral rolls and municipal records. Meanwhile, he decided to pay another visit to the neighborhood priest at Saint-Denis. The priest received him in a narrow, book-lined office that smelled of candle wax and damp stone. He remembered Fumel well, a quiet man of regular habits, devout but without ostentation. And yes, he recalled the stranger, who had loitered near the gates. A man with a soft manner, yes, and perhaps a faint smile. Did he ever attend services? Maigret asked. No, not inside. Always outside, as though waiting for something or someone. And did Monsieur Fumel speak of him? The priest hesitated, folding his hands. Once, perhaps. He wondered aloud why a stranger should take an interest in his health. He found it unsettling, though he said so only lightly. When Maigret left the church, the rain had thickened to a steady drizzle, the gutters rushing with brown water. He walked slowly, his hat pulled low, his thoughts circling. A stranger who lingered, a smile at the burial, a woman visiting in the night. The shape of the story was there, though still blurred, like a face behind frosted glass. That evening, as he sat once more in the café, d'Archambault entered. He was paler than before, his step heavier, but he greeted the proprietor with his usual politeness and ordered a coffee. He glanced briefly at Maigret, then away, as if the inspector's presence were no longer surprising but inevitable. After a time, Maigret rose and crossed to his table. He did not ask permission this time. He simply sat, his large figure filling the small space. They exchanged a few remarks about the weather, the rain that never seemed to end, the fog that crept into one's bones. Then, in the quiet way he preferred, Maigret asked, "The woman who visits you, is she your wife?" D'Archambault stiffened, his hand tightening on the cup. "No," he said after a pause. "She is an old acquaintance. From Tours." The man's eyes flickered, and Maigret knew the guess had struck close. But D'Archambault said nothing more. He drank his coffee, rose politely, and left, leaving coins on the table. The proprietor shook his head when Maigret looked at him. A strange fellow, always polite, but you never know what goes on behind those eyes. Later that night in his flat, Maigret told his wife only this: "There is a woman and there is a past, and somewhere between them lies the truth." He drank his beer slowly, staring at the pipe smoke curling toward the ceiling, and let the silence of the apartment settle around him. He did not need to say more. Madame Maigret understood that her husband was once again caught in the slow unraveling of a human tangle. As the rain tapped steadily against the window panes, Maigret felt the case tightening around him. It was no longer only about a smile at a funeral. It was about the invisible threads that tied D'Archambault to the dead man, to a woman from his past, and to the anonymous letter that had set everything in motion. He knew the truth was near, but like a figure in the fog, it would reveal itself only when he stood quietly enough, long enough, for it to step forward. The next days slid into each other with the same damp monotony of rain, the kind that blurred the outlines of Paris, until even the bridges and boulevards seemed like half-formed sketches. Maigret moved through it patiently, neither hurried nor idle, letting events draw themselves out as they wished. He had learned never to pull too sharply at a thread. One only needed to hold it, and sooner or later something tugged back. Lucas returned with more on Claire Vionnet. She had lived in Tours for many years after her separation from D'Archambault, working as a seamstress. Recently, though, her name had surfaced again in Paris. She was registered at a boarding house near Gare de l'Est, a modest place for transient lodgers. No record showed her tied formally to D'Archambault now, yet her sudden reappearance and nightly visits could hardly be coincidence. Maigret sat with the file open before him, filling the room with thick smoke. He was less interested in facts than in the silences between them. A woman from the past, a smile at the wrong funeral, an anonymous letter. It was not yet a story he could tell in words, but it was one he could feel forming around him. That afternoon he walked to the boarding house. It was a squat, peeling building that smelled of cabbage and cheap soap. The landlady, an ample woman in slippers, admitted that Claire Vionnet had taken a room for the past month. She was quiet, respectable, paid on time. She often left in the evenings and returned before dawn. The landlady added, with the easy gossip of her kind, that Claire seemed troubled, often pacing her room before going out, sometimes weeping softly when she thought no one heard. Maigret left without pressing. He had no warrant, no pretext, but more than that, he preferred not to intrude yet. He had what he needed, confirmation that Claire was here, that she moved through the nights like a restless spirit, tied once again to D'Archambault. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Janvier was waiting. He had spoken again to the daughters of Fumel. This time one of them remembered something more, a quarrel overheard weeks before their father's death. A man had come to the door, his voice low but sharp, their fathers raised in reply. They had caught only fragments, something about old accounts, about obligations never settled. Their father had dismissed it afterward, insisting it was nothing. But the daughter recalled one thing clearly. The man had smiled as he left, a smile that felt wrong in the middle of an argument. Maigret sat very still, his heavy face unreadable. It was not proof, but it was enough. The smile again, like a thread weaving its way through each scene. He let the silence stretch until Janvier shifted uneasily, then he dismissed him with a quiet nod. That evening he returned once more to the café. D'Archambault was there already, his paper unfolded, his coffee cooling untouched. The inspector sat opposite him without asking, filling his pipe, exhaling smoke that drifted between them like a veil. For a long time they said nothing. The clatter of cups, the murmur of conversation around them filled the space. Finally, Maigret asked almost gently, "Why did you quarrel with Fumel?" "You quarrel?" The man's eyes flickered, but his smile, small, restrained, appeared almost at once. "Quarrel? With Monsieur Fumel? You are mistaken." I barely knew him. Maigret said nothing, only held his gaze with that heavy, patient stillness that unnerved men more than accusations. D'Archambault shifted, folded his paper, and muttered something about early hours. He left coins on the table and walked out into the rain. Maigret did not follow. He never followed. He preferred to let men walk ahead of him, to reveal themselves when they thought they were unobserved. Later that night, he sat in his chair at Boulevard Richard Lenoir, his slippers on, the pipe smoke curling slowly. Madame Maigret knitted beside him. After a long silence, she said, "You are waiting for him to trip, aren't you?" He nodded slightly. "He's carrying something too heavy. A man can only smile so long before it breaks him." The following morning brought word from Lucas. Claire Vionnet had once been employed in the same firm where Fumel worked before retirement. Years ago, their names had appeared together in old payroll records. There had been whispers then of money gone astray, irregularities in the accounts, though nothing ever proven. The matter had been buried quietly. Now the fog began to thin. Maigret saw the outlines more clearly. An old scandal. A woman bound to both men in different ways, a smile that was less joy than defiance, perhaps even relief. He could not yet say what tied the strands together, but he knew they were tightening towards something inevitable. That evening, he walked once more into the rain-soaked streets of Saint-Denis. He stood by the churchyard where Fumel had been buried, his broad shoulders hunched under his coat. The graves were silent, the earth damp. He imagined d'Archambault there, standing apart, smiling faintly while others wept. And he knew with the same certainty he felt in his bones when storms gathered, that the truth lay not in documents or confessions, but in the weight of that smile. It was only a matter of waiting now. Waiting for silence to press hard enough that one of them, d'Archambault or the woman, or both, would break beneath it. The drizzle had turned to steady rain by the following morning, tapping against the tall windows of the Quai des Orfèvres. Maigret sat at his desk with his pipe unlit, staring at the envelope that had begun it all. The letter was still a mystery in itself. Why him? Why now? Why this particular man at this particular funeral? He rubbed his broad thumb along the fold of the paper, as though the texture might tell him what words could not. Janvier entered quietly, placing a fresh set of notes on the blotter. He had gone back further into the history of Auguste Fumel's employment, combing through old records and speaking with former colleagues. His findings were modest but troubling. Years earlier, when Fumel had still been an accountant, there had been a discrepancy in the books. Nothing had been proved, no charges filed, but it had been whispered among the staff that a small fortune had disappeared, covered neatly enough that no scandal arose. The firm had chosen discretion, and Fumel retired not long after. Do we know who worked closest with him? Maigret asked. Janvier hesitated. There was one name that kept coming up. Claire Vionnet. She assisted him at the time. Some said she was devoted, others less kind. There were suggestions. The inspector nodded slowly, tamping down his pipe with a thick forefinger. The triangle was complete now. The dead man, the woman, and d'Archambault, bound together by a past that had been buried as carefully as Fumel's coffin. Later that day, Maigret took a slow walk toward Gare de l'Est. The rain had left puddles that mirrored the soot-darkened facades of the buildings. The boarding house where Claire lived was unchanged, its entrance dim and smelling of damp stone. He waited across the street beneath the awning of a newspaper stall. In the early evening, Claire appeared, her scarf tied neatly, her coat buttoned to the throat. She moved with the poise of someone who had once known better circumstances, but her eyes flickered left and right as though expecting to be followed. She took the tram north. Maigret followed on foot at first, then boarded at the next stop, settling into a seat at the far end. The tram rocked through the misty streets, the windows fogged, the passengers drowsy with the monotony of rain. Claire kept her gaze fixed on her gloved hands. She descended at Saint-Denis and walked with quick steps, cutting through alleys until she reached the Rue des Ursulines. Without hesitation, she slipped inside the stairwell where d'Archambault lodged. Maigret did not follow her in. He stood outside in the drizzle, his hat low, listening to the muffled sounds of the street. Above him, faintly, a window creaked open and closed again. He imagined them together, voices hushed, words exchanged with the weight of years behind them. What tied them to Fumel? What debt or secret lingered after so long? Back at headquarters, he drafted no report. There was nothing to report, yet he instructed Lucas to discreetly inquire about money. Old debts, accounts, any mention of missing funds linked to Fumel or Claire. Such matters left traces, even when buried deep. The following morning, Lucas returned with something more tangible. Bank records from years ago showed unusual withdrawals from Fumel's accounts around the time of his retirement. The sums were not vast, but for a man of his modest salary they were significant. The money had vanished without explanation. There were no signs it had benefited his daughters. Rumor suggested it had been meant for someone else, someone who had leaned on him quietly. Blackmail? Lucas asked, his voice tinged with doubt. Maigret did not answer directly. He leaned back, puffing on his pipe, and stared at the ceiling. Perhaps not blackmail. Perhaps something more human, an old liaison, a promise made, a mistake shared. But whatever it was, it had not died with Fumel. It still lived in Darchambault's faint smile, in Claire's nightly visits, in the letter that had found its way to Maigret's desk. That evening he returned again to the café. The proprietor greeted him with a shrug, pouring his usual beer. The room smelled of wet coats, tobacco, and the sharp tang of cheap spirits. Darchambault was there, as Maigret knew he would be, seated at his usual place with the newspaper spread but unread. His face was pale, the smile absent tonight. He looked like a man waiting for a verdict he had not asked for. Maigret sat heavily opposite him, filling the space with his quiet presence. He spoke only once after a long silence. "Claire has come back into your life." The man's hand trembled slightly as he folded the paper. He looked at Maigret with eyes that were both tired and wary. "Yes, she has. And so has the past." For a moment Darchambault's lips twitched as though the familiar smile might surface, but it did not. Instead he rose, dropped coins on the table, and walked out into the night without another word. Maigret watched him go, then lingered until the café emptied. When at last he stepped into the wet streets, he felt not frustration, but the steady certainty that the silence would not hold much longer. People could not live indefinitely with secrets pressing against them. The letter had been the first crack. The smile at the funeral had been another. Soon, inevitably, something would break. At home, he sank into his chair with a sigh, his pipe between his teeth. Madame Maigret placed a small tray beside him, beer, cheese, and a slice of bread. She said nothing, but after a time she asked softly, "Is it nearly at an end?" He shook his head. "Not yet, but close. The truth is like water pressing behind a wall. It always finds a way through," and as the rain fell steadily outside, Maigret sat waiting, knowing that tomorrow or the day after, the wall would crack, and what was hidden would at last come pouring out. The days dragged forward with the same quiet inevitability, Paris wrapped in its cloak of drizzle and half-light. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret felt the case settle more heavily with each hour, though no formal crime had yet been named. He told himself, as he often did, that it was not the law that had brought him here, but something more elusive, an instinct that people's silences and small betrayals, if watched long enough, revealed their true shape. That morning, Lucas came in with news from the bank archives. He had traced further the pattern of withdrawals from Fumel's accounts. Not only had money been removed in the months before his retirement, but smaller sums had continued to vanish quietly in later years, always discreetly, never so much as to cause alarm, but enough to suggest an ongoing obligation. The trail ended only shortly before his death. "Do we know where it went?" Maigret asked. "Not yet. No deposits under his daughters' names, no property purchases, nothing visible." "It's as if it evaporated." Maigret leaned back, his thick fingers steepled. "Money never evaporated. It flowed unseen into someone's pocket, and if Fumel had continued paying quietly for years, it meant a hold had been kept on him, something too powerful to break." That afternoon, Maigret walked once more to the Rue des Ursulines. The rain had eased to a fine mist, and the streets were slick with a silver sheen. He entered the shoemaker's shop, exchanged a few words about repairs, and lingered long enough to see the tenants pass in and out. When at last Darchambault returned from his work, Maigret observed the way he climbed the stair, head bent, shoulders slightly hunched, like a man always aware of unseen eyes. Moments later, the faint glow of a lamp lit his window. The inspector did not approach. He walked instead to the café and took his usual place, sipping his beer, pipe idle. Hours passed. It was nearly midnight when the woman appeared. Claire moved quickly, her scarf pulled close, slipping inside the building with a glance over her shoulder. In the silence of the café, Maigret let the moment fix itself in his mind. The following day, Janvier brought more detail. Claire had indeed worked alongside Fumel decades earlier, trusted with his ledgers, his confidences. She had left the firm under vague circumstances, gossip hinting at impropriety, but nothing proven. Later, she had vanished into obscurity, surfacing only now, linked again with d'Archambault. Was she tied to him even then? Maigret asked. Difficult to say. Some records place them both in Tours around the same time. There may have been a connection, but no one remembers clearly. The inspector puffed slowly at his pipe. The silence between the facts was closing in now. A woman once tied to both men, money that bled away quietly over years, a smile at a burial, as though the end of one life had eased a burden carried too long. That evening Maigret stepped again into the café, his broad frame filling the small table opposite d'Archambault. He spoke gently, without preamble. You carried something for many years. It ended with Fumel's death, didn't it? D'Archambault looked at him, eyes hollow, lips pressed tight. For the first time the smile did not come, not even faintly. He drained his cup, rose without answering, and walked out into the rain. Maigret did not follow. He remained, watching the ripples of silence the man left behind. The proprietor muttered about strange lodgers, but the inspector barely heard him. He knew what he was waiting for. Not evidence, not even a confession. He was waiting for the human weight of it to break. Back at Boulevard Richard-Lenoir, Madame Maigret was darning a sock when he came in. She looked up at him quietly. He said only, "It's coming soon." She nodded, set aside her needle, and poured his beer. And as the rain pattered gently against the window, Maigret sat heavy in his chair, knowing that the long silence around Charles d'Archambault and Claire Vionnet was nearing its end. The rain did not let up. And by the time Maigret returned to the Quai des Orfèvres the following morning, the Seine ran swollen and brown beneath the bridges. His office smelled of damp wool as he removed his coat and hat, placing them carefully on the rack. The envelope still lay on his blotter, that quiet reminder of how it had all begun. He touched it briefly with his thick fingers, then leaned back and waited. He had learned to wait, more than any policeman ought to. It was nearly midday when Lucas entered, shaking droplets from his hat, bringing news from the bank. They had found traces of small deposits under Claire Vionet's name over the years, never large, never suspicious, but enough to suggest regular support from an unseen hand. Each one corresponded to the very periods when withdrawals had been noted from Fumel's account. So he kept her all that time, Lucas said, frowning. Even after she left the firm. It must have ruined him. Not ruined, Maigret said quietly, filling his pipe. Burdened. He let the smoke rise in silence, picturing the accountant in his modest flat, paying quietly each month as though the past itself charged him rent. Whether it had been love, guilt, or blackmail hardly mattered now. What mattered was that the thread had bound him until death. And with his death, the thread had snapped. In the afternoon, Maigret walked once more through the Rue des Ursulines. The shoemaker nodded from his bench, hammer tapping steadily, while the stairwell smelled of damp plaster. The concierge greeted him in whispers, reporting that the woman had visited again, her step lighter, almost relieved. Maigret climbed one flight, stopping before the door with the new lock. He did not knock. He only stood, listening to the muffled stillness behind it, then turned and descended again. He never forced such doors. They opened in their own time. That evening the café was emptier than usual. The rain kept people home. d'Archambault sat in his corner, his paper unopened, his face pale. He looked up when Maigret entered, and for the first time there was no sign of irritation, no guarded smile. He seemed almost to welcome the inspector's company, as a prisoner welcomes the guard who brings his supper. They sat in silence for a long while, until Maigret said softly, "It ended when he died, didn't it? Whatever tie held you, you smiled because you were free." d'Archambault's eyes trembled. His lips parted, but no words came. At last he whispered, "I didn't wish him harm. I know. I carried it too long. It wasn't mine to carry, but it became mine. And when they lowered him into the ground, I felt lighter." His hands shook slightly as he folded the newspaper, though it had remained unread all evening. He rose abruptly, muttered a farewell, and left. The proprietor leaned across the counter, whispering, "He's not well, that one. Looks as though he's carrying ghosts." Maigret finished his beer slowly, his thoughts heavy. It was not guilt he had seen in the man's eyes, not exactly. It was the relief of a burden gone, mixed with the shame of having felt relief at all. Back at Boulevard Richard-Lenoir, Madame Maigret was waiting with the supper kept warm on the stove. She watched him eat in silence, then asked quietly, "Has he spoken?" "Not yet, but he will." They always do in the end. The next morning the rain gave way to a brittle sunlight. The street steamed faintly, the air sharp with the smell of wet stone. At the office, Janvier arrived with a new detail. Years ago, after Claire had left the firm, she had been seen in the company of d'Archambault. A few colleagues remembered it, two lonely people drawn together, both with their ties to Fumel. Perhaps it had been nothing, perhaps something more. The whispers had faded, buried under time. But now, with the old man dead, the past had risen again. Maigret said nothing, only nodded as though the picture was clear enough. He waited until evening, then returned once more to the café. d'Archambault was there, as always, his presence as inevitable as the inspector's own. This time Maigret did not sit opposite him, but beside him, their shoulders almost touching, the smoke of their cups rising together. "You'll have to speak," he said gently. "Not for me, for yourself." d'Archambault closed his eyes a moment, and when he opened them there was a dampness there that was not from the rain. He whispered, "Tomorrow, not here." At the church, Maigret nodded, rose, and left without another word. That night in his flat he told his wife only that the end was near. She touched his arm lightly, the way she did when she wished to comfort without words. He sat in his chair, pipe in hand, thinking of the churchyard at Saint-Denis where it had all begun. With a smile at the wrong funeral, and he knew, as surely as he knew the rain would return, that tomorrow the silence would at last break, and the truth, however small and human, would step into the open. The following morning broke cold and clear. The rain washed away for once, leaving the streets slick and shining under a pale sky. Maigret rose early, his movements deliberate as though he already sensed the weight of the day. He dressed in silence, nodding briefly to Madame Maigret as she placed his coffee before him. She did not ask questions. She had lived too long at his side to demand explanations. She only said, "Take care of yourself," and he kissed her forehead before stepping out into the chill. He reached Saint-Denis before the bells struck 10. The church loomed grey and still, its stones damp with recent rain, the graveyard beyond quiet but for the cawing of crows. He stood with his heavy coat buttoned, pipe unlit in his pocket, watching his own breath rise in faint plumes. He had come with no file, no companions, no summons, only patience. He waited as he always did, letting the silence press until at last Charles d'Archambault appeared. The man walked slowly, his shoulders hunched, his hat brim low. He looked smaller in the morning light, like someone diminished by his own secrets. He paused when he saw Maigret standing near the gate, then continued forward, almost resigned. Together they entered the church, the inspector following a pace behind, their steps echoing against the cold flagstones. Inside it was dim, the air sharp with incense and damp stone. They sat in the rear pew, far from the altar, two men alone with the silence. For a long time nothing was said. d'Archambault's hands fidgeted on his lap, twisting the brim of his hat. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he began. It was never meant to last. Years ago, there was money. Not much, but enough. Fumel discovered it. He should have gone to the police, but he didn't. He covered it instead quietly for her sake. For Claire, the name lingered in the air, fragile. d'Archambault swallowed, his eyes fixed on the shadowy altar. She was desperate then, younger, proud. She had debts, foolish choices. I was already tied to her, though not as a husband, more like a accomplice of circumstance. Fumel kept her secret. He paid, month after month, and she never let him stop. I told her to let it rest, but she said he owed her, that he would ruin her otherwise. So he carried it year after year. His voice trembled, the words spilling out now with a kind of weary release. When he retired, she thought it would end, but it did not. He kept paying, smaller sums, always discreet. He never told his daughters, never complained. I think he was ashamed, and I carried her guilt too, because I loved her, because I couldn't leave her. I became the watchman of her secret. I stood at the edges of his life, making sure the silence held. Maigret listened without moving, his thick hands folded, his eyes steady. The man's confession was less of crime than of sorrow, a tangle of love and dependence that had eaten away at 3 lives. When he died, d'Archambault whispered. I felt it break inside me. The weight fell away, I smiled, because I could breathe again. And then I hated myself for smiling. The silence in the church grew heavier. Only the faint creak of the pews and the distant drip of water echoed. D'Archambault's shoulders sagged, his face pale. He looked at Maigret then, almost pleading. You see, there was no murder, only weakness. Only people bound by mistakes too old to untangle. What will you do now, Monsieur le Commissaire? Maigret filled his pipe slowly, though he did not light it. His voice was low, steady. Nothing. The man is dead, the debt is gone, and there is no crime left for the law to touch. But you will carry it, as you have carried it all along. D'Archambault closed his eyes, nodding faintly. It was not absolution, but it was enough. He rose, bowed slightly, and walked toward the door, his steps echoing across the stone floor. The morning light caught him briefly as he disappeared into the street. Maigret remained seated for a while longer, the pipe resting unlit between his fingers. He thought of Fumel, of Claire, of the long years of silence paid for in coins and in pride. He thought of d'Archambault's smile, not joyous but weary, the smile of a man who had mistaken relief for freedom. When at last he left the church, the air was bright and sharp. He walked slowly through the streets of Saint-Denis, stopping at a café for a glass of white wine. The city carried on as always, children hurrying to school, shopkeepers sweeping their thresholds, trams rattling past. Life went on, indifferent to the small tragedies that unfolded in quiet rooms and at forgotten funerals. That evening, back at Boulevard Richard Lenoir, Madame Maigret set before him a stew of lamb and carrots. She watched him for a moment, reading the fatigue in his face, and asked, "Did you find what you were waiting for?" He nodded slowly, chewing, swallowing, then setting down his fork. "I found it. Not a crime, only a burden, one that ended with a smile at the wrong funeral." She said nothing more, only poured his beer. He lit his pipe at last, the smoke curling upward, and sat in silence. Outside, the city was drying under a pale sky, but in his mind the rain still fell softly, carrying away the last traces of a secret too ordinary, too human, to ever make the newspapers. The next day, the city went about its business as if nothing at all had shifted, though for Maigret the weight of the story had already settled into its final shape. He had not written a report, for there was nothing to write. No crime, no charges, no pursuit of justice through courts or cells. Only the quiet collapse of a secret that had bound 3 lives together for decades. He walked once more through Saint-Denis, stopping at the café where the case had seemed to circle endlessly. The proprietor greeted him with his usual shrug, pouring a beer without being asked. The room smelled of smoke and damp wool, and voices murmured softly from the corners. Maigret sat heavily, pipe in hand, and let the glass sweat slowly before him. D'Archambault did not appear, nor did Claire. Perhaps they would not return again. Perhaps the silence they had carried had at last exhausted itself. He thought of the dead man Fumel lying now in the wet earth. He thought of the daughters who would never know the weight their father had borne in silence, protecting them from scandal, from shame. He thought of Claire, worn and diminished, and of d'Archambault, whose smile had betrayed him not because it was cruel, but because it was too human, too naked an expression of relief. People spoke of crime as though it were sharp and sudden. Yet more often it was this, a slow erosion, a compromise repeated until it hardened into habit, until all were trapped. When he rose at last, he left his glass half empty. Outside the air was clear, the sky pale, the streets washed clean. He walked without hurry back toward the Seine, his overcoat flapping faintly in the breeze. At Boulevard Richard Lenoir, Madame Maigret was waiting, her quiet smile as steady as the home they had built together. She asked no questions, only served him his supper and poured his beer. After the meal, he sat in his chair, pipe smoke curling toward the ceiling, and listened to the faint hum of the city beyond the windows. His mind drifted back to that first anonymous letter, to the funeral where he had seen the wrong smile, to the long days of watching and waiting. He felt no triumph, only the quiet ache of recognition, that people were frail, that love and fear twisted together, left stains no law could erase. He tapped the ashes from his pipe, folded his hands across his belly, and let the silence fill the room. Another case, if one could call it that, had come to its end. The papers would never print a word of it. The records would hold no trace. Yet for him it was enough, the truth, small and human, resting now where it belonged, in the damp Paris air, and in the memory of one man who had waited long enough to see it revealed. And as the night deepened, Maigret closed his eyes, hearing once more the faint echo of rain against stone, the hush of a funeral procession, and the sight of a man who had smiled quietly at the wrong time, quietly at the wrong